Hi guys, my name is Dylan Thompson, and today I'm going to be telling you everything that I know about Effie Waller-Smith. Now, to start off, Effie Waller-Smith was a black poet, writer, and a teacher, though not a lot is known about her teaching career. Not a lot is known about her in general, but teaching career kind of the most of it. In the beginning, a little bit before she was born, we're going to backtrack a bit, her father was Frank Waller, and her mother was Sibby Ratliff. They were both ex-slaves. Frank Waller, he moved to Kentucky, I think it was Pike County, Kentucky, after the Civil War, which he fought in. Before that, he belonged to the Waller family. That's where he took his last name from. With them, he was able to learn about blacksmithing, farming, and things like that. Whenever he came to Kentucky, because he was already a farmer and a blacksmith, he was able to use those skills, and he was also able to be like a real estate scout kind of person. I don't know much about that, but I do know that because of that, he was seen as an entrepreneur and he was really well respected. He and Sibby both ended up living in this kind of area where they were really racially integrated, especially for just after the Civil War, and especially in like a place like Kentucky. So he had respect from both black and white neighbors, and whenever he got enough money, he went to Sibby Ratliff, and he was like, hey, I have money, can we get married and start a family? And she, more or less said yes. Sibby Ratliff was the ex-slave of a man named Ratliff. I don't remember his first name, but I do know that he did not own slaves for her and her mother. He sympathized with them, however, and whenever he went to this one area, he found that they were selling a slave family, and he tried to buy as many of them as he could to keep the family together, but he only had enough to buy Sibby and her mother. Sibby and Frank, they didn't have the best education, so they ended up having 4 kids. Effie Waller was the third of 4, and they decided that all of their kids were going to be very well educated. They didn't want them to, be behind like they were, or, well, I guess not behind, but they wanted them to have more opportunities than they had. So, they went to the best school that they could send them to, which was the Normal School for Colored People, I think it was called. It was in something Fort, Kentucky. It's like the best school in Kentucky at the time that black people could go to. So she graduates from there. She pursues a degree in teaching, and so she becomes a teacher. In 1904, she published her first book of poetry. That book was the Song of something, Songs of the Month, I think, and there was like over 100 poems in that book. She ended up publishing 2 more books, both in 1908. She published some short stories and some like articles in some really prestigious magazines like Harper Weekly, things that were like hard to get into, I guess. As far as I know, I just know that it was a really big accomplishment. She was married twice. She was married the first time to a guy named Lule. I don't really remember his name because he ended up walking out on her like within a year, and then she filed for divorce, and that was kind of sad. I think that was in 1906, maybe? And then in 1908, like 1908, she met Charles Smith, and she was like, oh, I think I'll give love another chance. And she and Charles, they ended up having a kid. Their kid died in infancy, and so that loss kind of set in on them, and it kind of pushed them apart to where their marriage started failing, she ended up filing for a divorce, but I don't think the divorce went through because I think he died before it actually went through. So there's that. But that is only in 1908. She was born in 1879 and lived until 1960. She saw the entirety of the civil rights movement. And I think that's pretty crazy. Maybe not the entirety, but most of it. And also the Cold War. And also both? Yeah. She saw both world wars and the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement. All of that all took place during her lifetime, and I think that's crazy. Her life story does not end at 1908, is basically what I'm trying to say. Her life story goes on. In the 1920s, her friend, Polly, I think that was her name, the Mullins family. I think her name was Polly Mullen. I don't know. Yeah, so backtrack a little bit. Whenever she was in school and she first started teaching, she lived with the Mullins family. They put her up and she became very good friends with Polly Mullins, who was her student. So yeah, it was whenever she first started teaching then. So she first starts teaching. She's friends with Polly Mullins and the Mullins family because they put her up. Polly Mullins is her student. They have a really great friendship. Also, her dad died. Just gonna throw that in there. And so she and her family moved. I don't remember where. I think it was like Wisconsin or something. Yeah, I think it was Wisconsin. Because Polly Mullins gets sick and she's like, hey, if I die, because I don't think I'm going to make it through this, can you take my daughter and watch over her? Her daughter was born in whenever Ruth Mullins. I don't remember. Ruth was her name, though. That's whenever she was born. She was like 10 whenever her mom died. Effie didn't end up taking her right away. Ruth went and lived with her grandparents at first, and then Effie realized, oh wow, your grandparents are horrible. Well, not necessarily horrible, but the conditions they're raising you in are horrible. So then she picks Ruth up and she takes her, and they end up living in either Kentucky or Wisconsin. That's where she spent the majority of her time. She taught a lot in Tennessee, but she mostly lived in Kentucky and Wisconsin. Her daughter Ruth ends up going on and pursuing a teaching career as well. And in like the 1950s, 1960s, that area, Effie ends up going and moving in with Ruth, and she spends the rest of her days with her, and she's just lives a quiet life. She hung up writing and stuff in 1909. I think that was the last time she ever wrote anything and published it. And for a really long time, the only person who knew her story was her daughter Ruth. And even now, people don't really know about her. And I find that kind of sad because she has a lot of great poetry. And she was able to live and do things that a lot of black people, I believe, in that time couldn't really do. So that's my lecture on Effie Waller-Smith. Have a good night.